out the eons of Fireside at this point, see what we've been building up to. And if you are a returning listener, as always, thank you for your continued support. It is so nice to be recording again and back in the rhythm and routine of it. All the usual ways you can support the podcast. You can follow me over on Instagram at FiresideBard. You can email me at thefiresidebard@gmail.com. And you can join Headstuff Plus at headstuffpodcast.com, where for as little as €5 a month, although you can pay more if you want, you can gain access to bonus material, not just for Fireside, but for all of the podcasts on the Headstuff Podcast Network. And the final and my favorite way you can support the podcast is you can buy my book, Garden Sea and Neo-Myth of Home, my poetry collection, which mixes all of the folklore, mythology, history, religion, and storytelling of Ireland with my own experiences growing up there. We can ship the paperback anywhere around the world, and you can get it instantly on Kindle. And that is all the housekeeping done. This episode, it's nice. Thank you so much to those, the 3 episodes of Fireside we uploaded last week after unintended prolonged hiatus. Have been so well received, and it's been so nice getting all your messages and emails. That really, really does mean the world to me, so thank you so much. I have replied to a lot of them. I'm endeavouring to reply to them all, because it does really mean a lot, and it's a great amount of encouragement that the audience is still there and continuing to grow, and that's definitely going to help now with the output of getting back in the routine. Those 3 episodes last week, that was definitely just for me to dust the cobwebs off and as a reward for those who've been waiting. But now we will get back to the regular routine of the episodes coming out every Wednesday in perpetuity. The story for this week's episode comes once again from this beautiful new book I found, Celtic Weird, published by the British Library and edited by Johnny Mains or Johnny Mons. And as I said before, my favourite thing about this book, I've always liked to let my life guide the podcast. So that's, for example, when I was travelling abroad and was in places like Australia and New Zealand, it was really nice to dip into folklore from those countries, do like the story of the Seven Sisters from Indigenous Aboriginal folklore in Australia, and then from New Zealand to have a tale about Maui. And basically, yes, just anything that I'm doing or anywhere that I let these things present themselves to me and try and look for the synchronicities out there, I guess. And this book was one that I found within my first couple of weeks in London. And this, my favorite thing about this was not just the beautiful design of it and that it was a collection of stories that I didn't know before for the most part. I think I haven't encountered one in it that I have covered or had read before yet. But my favorite thing was that it was covering all of the Celtic languages and all of the insular Celtic cultures from around the 2 islands of Britain and Ireland. And because there's a lot that's untapped there, and then there's a lot that really overlaps between all these various different cultures and stories. And so me being based in Britain now for the time being, that felt like the right direction as well, because I'm getting more of a sense of the other Celtic cultures aside from the Irish, Scottish and Welsh, which I already would be familiar with. And so being able to explore lesser known ones, certainly in Ireland, like the Isle of Man, and this week's story being Brittany, which there is this sense that someone just came in the door. There is this sense that there are 2 kind of different Celtic societies and Celtic cultures. There are insular Celts, which is what the Irish and all the aforementioned ones would be in. And then we have more like mainland continental Celts, which would have been, what the Battle of Gaul against Rome would have been, and led by Vercingetorix. And they're actually, even though these were called Celts as well, they have this sense now that there was no actual connection by blood or by lineage between these 2. They kind of grew separately, which is why we have the term insular Celts to describe the Irish and those other mix of collections of cultures. So that's where Brittany is curious, because that exists now on the continental Europe, but very much did grow as an insular Celtic language. And seeing it there's names in the story that seem very, very French, but seeing it pronounced and seeing it spoken, it has a commonality and a common strain with Welsh and with Cornish, for example, which is another one of the insular Celtic languages, whereas Manx, the Manx language, would have far more in common with Scottish or Irish. Now, I am not at all a linguist in any way. This is all very much new stuff for me for the most part, because my primary interest is in the stories and is in seeing the similarities and the differences between these very, very similar cultures and how they grew apart and grew similarly, by either borrowing from each other or independent from each other. And so the thing about this story particularly, was, as I said at the end of last week's episode, it was something that I don't think we'd really covered on the podcast at all, which was werewolves. And it is curious, in all the weird and wonderful monsters and creatures that we have come across throughout the course of Fireside, that this should be the first tale. We have it's something so ubiquitous in folklore and in horror as a werewolf and a man-wolf or a wolf-man, and we're going to learn that there are differences between all of them. But we will chat more after, of course, but we'll first of all get right down to the story. This is the tale of the werewolves on the other side on Fireside. The werewolves of the other side. By the fireside in a small village that lay on the edge of a brook, two old women were having a drink. On the floor before them sat an enthralled, doe-eyed boy, hanging off their every word. And you must never cross the brook to the other side, for there dwell werewolves and wolfmen and man-wolves, and all of them that lose themselves for 9 days of every year to that madness. And they are led by the wolf keeper, who rides on top of a monstrous black ram. Is that true, Nea Pinkley? Gabriel asked the old woman telling the story. Of course it is, said the old crone. And with this, she bore her teeth to show the boy her fang-like canines. Are you a werewolf? Asked Gabriel. Gabriel, don't speak to your elders like that, said the boy's mother, Mère Yvonne. Of course not, child. And wait till I tell you what they do to children. But the story was interrupted by the sound of a distant howl, loud, high, and piercing. It made those in the house tremble with fear. Right, Gabriel, said Mère Yvonne. I think it's time for bed. Gabriel was not a popular boy. He had a gentle spirit and tried to be nice to everyone, which was frequently perceived as weakness or cowardice. His only two friends were the local priest, Abbé Félicien, and a young girl named Carmea. These two liked the qualities in Gabriel that others did not. So nevertheless, the boy spent a lot of his time on his own. The morning after hearing Mère Pinkley's tale, Gabriel went and sat by the brook on the edge of the village. No one crossed to the other side. This was widely known. But Gabriel had not been made aware that it was because of wolves. And he didn't know if he quite believed that. The brook was narrow. It could easily be hopped over. And a wolf had never been seen on that side of the river. Gabriel sat there as the sun set, and the moon rose high in the sky. It was a full moon, which fully illuminated the forest on the other side. And in the midst of the wood, Gabriel could see a bunch of wild blue flowers, a blue unlike any he had seen in water, sky, or painting. It seemed to glow in the darkness. Surely I can cross to the other side to pick a flower, he thought to himself. I'll be over and back in 10 seconds. And the moon is bright, so I'll see any danger. But the danger was far from his mind, because Gabriel was transfixed upon the flower. A trance, almost. He had to have one. So the young boy stood and hopped over to the other side of the brook. He went up to the flowers, but as he knelt down, a cloud covered the lyrical moon, and suddenly Gabriel did not just notice the flora. He noticed eyes, red eyes all around him. He rooted to the ground like the flowers he craved. The eyes gave shape to wolves, and not just wolves, but wolves with the faces of men, and men with the faces of wolves, and owls perched above them, with eyes as red as the beasts below. And most terrifying of all was the wolf keeper, who sat on the back of a giant black ram, with a face covered in shadow. Despite his fear, the wolf pack did not seem to notice or care about Gabriel. They were on their way somewhere, and kept moving through the forest. And just as cloud cleared, and the moon illuminated the other side once more, Gabriel swore he could see a head of golden hair, with eyes as blue as the flowers. But as another cloud passed over, Gabriel could only see a wolf. The fear jolted him out of his catatonic state, and Gabriel ran and jumped back over the brook, but not before grabbing a blue flower. Gabriel didn't think the flower would mean as much to his mother as it did to him. Nevertheless, he showed it to her when he got home. Mère Yvonne turned white when she saw the blue flower. "Gabriel, where did you get that? That's a witch's flower. It will only bring you bad luck." She grabbed the flower off her son and threw it in the corner of the room. The second it hit the ground, the blue flower withered, limp and black. It was as if it had been set on fire. It looked as if Mère Yvonne was right, and there was some dark magic at play. That night, Gabriel couldn't sleep. He was sad to have lost the prize he had nearly got devoured by werewolves to claim. So quietly, Gabriel climbed back downstairs and found the charred remains. The moment he picked it up, the flower bloomed once more and was as brilliant and blue as before. Gabriel fell into a light sleep, a lucid sleep, where you can't tell if you were awake or unconscious. In his dreams, he could hear voices out his window, low, dark, whispering voices in an unintelligible language. The only word he could make out was his own name. The next day, Gabriel was at Mass, aiding Abbé Félicien as his altar server. The priest began the traditional opening of the Latin Mass. Introibo ad altere Dei, or I will go into the altar of God. The assembly responded, Ad Deum qui letificat juventutem meam, or to God who gives joy to my youth. All except for Gabriel, that is, who instead replied, Quine quiquam letificafit juventutem meam. Abbé Félicien turned in shock at this response, for what Gabriel had said was, to God, who has in vain gladdened my youth. Such blasphemy would have been appalling from a thief in the night, never mind the sweet and gentle Gabriel. But there was no time to scold, for as soon as Gabriel spoke the Latin, he fainted. When he came to, Gabriel left the church and met up with Carmea. She thought the fresh air would do him good. Gabriel had failed to show the blue flower to Abbé Félicien for fear he might respond worse than his own mother had, but he felt he could share anything with Carmea. The little girl took the flower and instantly went a whiter shade of pale. "Gabriel, where did you get that? I touched it for 1 second, and now I feel awful. Please, throw it away." Before Gabriel could respond, Carmea tossed the flower over the brook, where it instantly withered once more. Where the flower landed, a wolf suddenly appeared. Carmea leapt up and screamed, but Gabriel stared into the wolf's eyes and was transfixed. They were the same blue eyes of the flower, the same eyes he had seen the night before that had belonged to the golden-haired girl. "She will not harm us," Gabriel told Carmea. "But it's a wolf, Gabriel," protested Carmea. "I know, but we are safe." The wolf stayed a while staring at Gabriel before being spotted by some villagers, where she ran off. This was the first time a wolf had been spotted on this side of the brook, and the men of the village could hardly contain their delight at the prospect of a wolf hunt. Wolf pelts were incredibly valuable after all. That night, Gabriel slept uneasily. He once again heard the voices from his window, so he leaned up in his bed and gazed out into the darkness. He tried to make out the strange language being spoken. Mazala liral vale, quamulo jara gelage, karma uradi el jave, jarma sima karme, jala javale traje, alvu alvlaula, va azre, safralje, vairalje, vaja, karma seraja, laja, laja, loja. And there in the night were the bright blue eyes and the golden hair. To look at this person, Gabriel felt as if he'd known her all his life, and he felt compelled to follow her. Clad only in his nightshirt, Gabriel left the house and followed the golden-haired girl. She led him to the other side, which Gabriel hesitantly crossed once more. But once he did, the girl disappeared, and a wolf was left in her place. Gabriel panicked, grabbed the nearest thing to hand, which was a large log, and struck the beast on the head. The wolf howled and turned back into the girl. "Oh, Gabriel, why did you strike me? I would have loved you forever, and we would have been so happy together." "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was you," said the boy. The golden-haired girl collected a strange-shaped leaf and held it to her forehead. "Kiss here, Gabriel, and all will be well." And Gabriel did as he was told, and tasted blood and passed out. Suddenly he was surrounded once more by the full pack, and they continued to speak in their strange tongue. The wolf-keeper spoke most, and with all of the authority, and Gabriel heard them begin to chant. He didn't know what they were saying, but he knew by the rising rhythm that this was some kind of prayer or incantation. The one thing he could make out was his own name again, and the name of the wolf girl, Lilith. Gabriel awoke in his own bed. At least, it looked like his own bed. It looked like his room, but for the wall. On his bedroom wall was a large crucifix and a portrait of the Virgin Mary, which he had prayed before many times. But when he awoke from what he hoped was a dream, The cross and the portrait were gone. He thought to pray regardless, that he might still feel better after these night terrors of devilish deeds. But when he went to make the sign of the cross, he couldn't remember how it went. Then he tried to remember the Lord's Prayer or the Hail Mary, but both escaped him. Did he ever know them? He went downstairs to find his mother, but instead found Lilith sitting at the kitchen table. "There you are. You slept late today, mon cœur." Which was the dream and which reality? Gabriel no longer knew. Of course, he thought, he had always lived here, with this beautiful young woman with the azure eyes and radiant hair. This was his home, and she his companion. Days, weeks, months passed, who can say how long, and Gabriel completely forgot all memory of his previous life. That had been the dream. He was sure of it. Until one day he was out walking with his love when they came to a brook, and Gabriel saw a bunch of wild blue flowers, the cause of all of his woes. Something stirred in him, a memory, déjà vu, something. "What are these flowers?" he asked Lilith, but she gave no answer. Gabriel approached the brook and gazed at the other side. Or was he on the other side now? "Stay away from there, my love," cried the girl. "It's dangerous." "How is it dangerous? It's only a shallow stream. And tell me what these blue flowers are." The blue-eyed girl dodged the flower question once more and said, "You may think it's safe, but look into the water. It does not flow." Sure enough, Gabriel gazed down at the stream, and the water was still, like crystal, like glass. You could see your reflection uninterrupted. Gabriel stared at his reflection and thought he could hear voices. Not the strange language of before, but Latin. The words of Abbe Felician, recitations and prayers. He asked the still water, "What are these flowers?" And the water replied, "It is called Luli Uzuri. Just 2 drops squeezed from its stem, and you will fall into a deep slumber." But before he could ask the water any more, Lilith grabbed Gabriel by the hand and dragged him home. She did not know, however, that he had already plucked a flower. That night, it all came back to Gabriel, all the memories of his true home. He could hear the voices of his mother, the priest, and Carmea praying for his soul. He squeezed 2 drops from the flower onto the sleeping Lilith's forehead and ran from the house. He made his way to the brook and leaped over. But in mid-air, Gabriel found his leap had turned into a bound, and when he landed on all 4s. And that's where he remained. He felt strange, a strange taste in his mouth. He felt hot and itchy. He crawled over to the brook and saw his reflection. It was his face, all right. But Gabriel now had the body of a wolf. He had become one of them. Gabriel went out to let out a cry, but the only sound he could make was a howl, high, loud, and piercing. And the howl awoke the village, and soon Gabriel saw a mob with torches held high. His howls had also awoken the pack, and Gabriel turned to see the werewolves and the man-wolves and the wolf-men, and towering above them on his black ram the wolf-keeper with his face covered in shadow. Amongst the pack, Gabriel could make out Lilith, with the body of a wolf, but still the beautiful face, eyes, and hair of her human form. Gabriel was trapped. He didn't know who to run from and who toward. The mob would surely hunt him, The pack imprisoned him. But through the crowd of villagers came forth Abbe Felicion, who held the goblet of the Eucharist high and said, "They cannot harm us." He marched towards Gabriel, who let out a final howl before turning back into human form. He bowed at the feet of the priest, who had saved him from the fire. But fire would not accept easy defeat. On the other side, the wolf keeper lifted high his hands and displayed his own sacraments, the sacrament of hell. The wolf keeper spurted fire from his hands, which engulfed the pack, the forest, and the entire other side of the brook. Today, the charred remains of the other side no longer pose a threat to anyone. No wolf, no werewolf, no wolfman, no man-wolf has ever been seen since. But still, no one ventures across to the other side. Except, of course, for Gabriel, who for 9 days of every year loses himself to madness. The end. And that is the tale of the werewolves of the other side on Fireside, and I really hope you enjoyed it. This was very fun to do, not just for it being a Breton tale, which brings kind of a new flavour anyway, with its names alone and playing around with other languages, which, while I'm not the strongest at, is really fun to do. Like, for starters, we had a few languages at play here. We obviously had the French names, but then we had some Latin, which was like the traditional, like specifically French Catholic Latin Mass. And then we have this completely invented language for this language of the werewolves, which all comes from, which I did look up. I tried to research if it was a language, if it was based on another language, and it is completely an invention of the story's original author, who is a very curious gentleman by the name of Stanislaus Stenbock, who was for a time a student at Oxford. And I think the most curious thing about him, he suffered throughout his life with alcoholism and opium addiction, and did die quite young. But the most curious thing about him, besides writing such an interesting tale in the late 1800s, is that he carried around with him at all times a doll, a life-size doll, which he referred to as his son. And anytime the doll was not with him, he always asked after it and was worried for its health care. So this is a very curious gentleman, as a lot of these tales often come from. And that is a detail almost is more interesting than anything in the story, especially because it is true. But to talk about the werewolves for a second, I find it curious the difference and the distinction between werewolves, man-wolves, and wolf-men. Because there's a detail in common werewolf lore that we would be familiar with from stories and movies and things. We have this concept that it's almost similar to vampire, in that you have to be bitten by a werewolf, and then, depending on how vampiric it gets, to drink the blood of a werewolf as well. And that is what will save you from death and turn you in. But of course, typically it is dictated by the lunar calendar that it is full moon. Every full moon you turn into a werewolf. And then, of course, that the only thing that can kill a werewolf is the silver bullet. But we have a different kind of variations here. For starters, we have these wolves that have the faces of men and men with the faces of wolves. And we have this detail that it is for 9 days of every year. So it is just all packed in together as this one series. Now that could be perceived as an individual 9 days. I think of it seems to be more suggesting that it is just these 9 days together each year. So it's just this 1 week and a half where you lose yourself completely. You go to Werewolf Glastonbury once a year, and then you just come back and you regain your senses until it comes back next year, and you have to fuck off once more. But so Gabriel is more bewitched in this story than he is bitten. It's not implied that he is bitten or turned. But then also these werewolves seem to be very specifically satanic, especially with this wolf keeper. It was my favorite image of it on the black ram, and then just like setting them all on fire and setting the entire brook on fire at the end. And he very much is defeated by the sacraments of the priest of Abbe Félicien. There's been a lot of priests featured recently in quite heroic capacities fighting these forces of evil in a very literal sense. And we have, like, I even was researching when looking this up, how it said in the story that the wolf displayed the kind of the reverse, the symbols of the Antichrist, or the reverse of whatever Abbe Félicien was presenting, which was quite nondescript, and there's no specific sacraments, except, of course, we have this idea of the crucifix turned upside down. But my favorite image was, of course, just it having the hands turning to fire, and of course, fire being the great symbol of Lucifer and of hell and the underworld. Then the other thing that we're playing around with a lot in this story is dreams, of course, and that's where what is real and what is dream. Because we actually do have a situation where Gabriel goes and gets the flower. He comes home, he falls asleep, he wakes up and retrieves the flower and then goes back asleep again. The next day, he starts to notice these effects. He is feeling this sense in Mass when he says this phrase in Latin that is blasphemous. So we see already that he is starting to be turned, and that these are very anti-God creatures, by the fact that this saying almost comes out of him. And then he goes that night, he sees the wolf girl that night, Lilith, who his name is of course, anyone who might be familiar with this, like Lilith is one of the brides of the devil and bride of Satan. Very well played by, I believe it's Alex Kingston, in the chilling episodes of Sabrina, if anyone remembers that Netflix show. Lost its way a bit, but there was some really good promise in the early seasons of that. And that's where I first discovered kind of this lore of Lilith as this bride of Satan. I don't think this Lilith is meant to be that one specifically, but obviously it's not a coincidence she is named that either. But he discovers her, and even though it seems that the werewolves are not turned to wolves every lunar cycle and then every full moons still do play a significant part in this story, because, and in a very curious way, in that when the full moon is out, they appear in wolf form, and then when the cloud covers, then they appear in human form, or at least they do to Gabriel. And that is where his confusion comes from, and how he sees this beautiful, enchanting person when it's covered, and then the moonlight only sees this wolf form. But he falls into this dream, and this incantation that he hears in this other language happens, and then he hears her name mentioned as well, Lilith's. So they are binded together in this incantation, and this seems to be the recruitment for these werewolves, man-wolves, and wolfmen. And then Gabriel falls into a subsequent dream. So he's almost 2 dreams deep, and that is where he loses a sense of what he remembers and what is real and what is not, which is always great in a story like this, because it really plays around with the fabric of reality, which I feel makes it more believable when you add a dream element to it. If it's done right, rather than in the quintessential cliche, it was all a dream way, that can be really, really useful, because we have all had dreams where we're not sure where if it is real or not, and we wake up, and especially if you lucid dream and all, which I do quite often, where I often will dream of something that actually is happening that day, or has just happened, or is about to happen, And it can create this sense of delirium, which works really well in this kind of storytelling. And then Gabriel, of course, is finally rescued by Abbe Felician, and after he realizes he himself has turned into a wolf, which also seems to be that he only is in wolf form when he returns to his own world, that there is this kind of portal between one side of the brook and the other side, which is a great phrase, because that is the phrase that we use for the world of the fairies in Irish folklore, is the other side, or the other world, or the others, the other folk. And Gabriel arrives and discovers he is in wolf form and is only rescued by the incantations and the prayers of his priest friend. And the wolf beings are banished in this beautiful, incredible display of fire. But then as a final addendum, that Gabriel himself is not entirely cured, and that still once a year has to go to Werewolf Glastonbury until he can return once again to civilization. So there's a lot of, it's really, really dense and fun stuff here, and I really hope you all enjoyed it. I'm going to wrap things up now, but next week we will have another, I believe it is a Scottish tale next, also from the book. I will put as always, the source in the show notes below, where you can also follow me on Instagram and buy my book, Garden Sea, New Myth of Home. I beg your pardon. Oh yes, next week we have the tale of the Devil's Horse, which is another really fun one. I'm really, really enjoying all of the ones I've been finding in Celtic Weird at the moment. They have, as the title would suggest, a real darkness and weirdness to them. But as always, let me know any of your thoughts, critiques, comments, what kind of stories you want to hear, your thoughts on current stories. If you think I'm right, you think I'm wrong, the engagement is always incredible. Follow me over on Instagram at FiresideBard. Email me at thefiresidebard@gmail.com. Buy my book, Garden Sea. I will see you all. You'll hear me all next time. And remember, wherever you are and wherever you go, you can always join me by the fireside.
This show is part of the Head Stuff Podcast Network, a hub for the creative and the curious. Shows are produced in association with Head Stuff and the Podcast Studios Dublin. Find out more or become a member at headstuffpodcasts.com.